the most inbred woman in history who gave birth to a monster. Mariana of Austria and the Curse of the Habsburg Jaw. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that drifts through candlelight corridors, whispers behind gilded doors, and echoes in empty chapels. Settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, because we're floating back to 1661 Madrid, where the Habsburg palace smelled of incense, opulence, and a quiet kind of dread. And yes, it was all very official and very royal, but also very broken. Mariana of Austria, our heroine if you can call her that, was married to her uncle, which was fairly common in European courts because why not double down on keeping the bloodline pure? Her parents had been first cousins, her grandparents, uncle and niece. And if you trace the branches back far enough, 16 generations, you find a 14th century count who married his own sister. The family tree wasn't a tree. It was a single, twisted vine wrapped around itself until it choked logic and health out of anyone it touched. Mariana herself was considered beautiful in that very strict, very royal way. Pale skin, dark eyes, delicate hands. She had been trained in the art of courtly manners, needlework, prayer, and knowing when to look horrified at her husband's latest fainting spell. Philip IV, the king and her uncle, adored her for reasons historians still debate, whether for political expedience, genuine affection, or the simple thrill of marrying someone whose DNA was alarmingly similar to his own. The court doctors, of course, whispered behind closed doors that this union was dangerous, but whispers do little when crowns are involved. And then came the heir, Charles, later Charles II, born into the gilded madness of the Spanish Habsburg court. From the start, he was unlike any infant anyone had seen. Eyes bulging, tongue too large for speech, a jaw so pronounced it hung open as though he were perpetually surprised by existence itself. His legs, weak and thin, forced him to crawl instead of walk until he was 8, much to the fascination and horror of the court physicians. Mirrors were hidden by palace maids because they feared the boy would see his own reflection and perhaps shriek, and Mariana herself began locking herself in the royal chapel every night, lighting votive candles to purge the curse from her son's tiny, fragile body. Priests performed secret exorcisms over his crib, muttering Latin prayers while the infant slept, oblivious to the fervor around him. Wet nurses became the invisible guardians of his survival. Goat milk laced with opium quieted his seizures, because otherwise, no one was sure how long the boy might last, and last he did, limping and crawling and swallowing through a jaw that seemed more sculpture than mouth. His intellect and speech were stunted, but his parents, and particularly Mariana, believed he could still embody the perfection of the Habsburg line. A dynasty so obsessed with its own blood that it refused to recognize its own fragility. The palace, as you might imagine, became a theater of whispered curses and silent dread. Servants spoke of shadows lingering longer than they should, of faint cries echoing in empty halls. Courtiers avoided the nursery when possible, not out of cruelty, but because even proximity to the heir seemed to amplify his strange, twisted aura. He was called the Bewitched Heir, a moniker whispered behind closed doors, though never officially written on court documents. As Charles grew, so did the complications. By the age of 20, he was infertile. His testicles had never descended, his body incapable of fulfilling the sacred duty of producing heirs. But Mariana, driven by devotion, obsession, or sheer desperation, forced him into a political marriage with his own niece, a girl young and terrified, her innocence dangling over a dynastic experiment gone wrong. The wedding night was brief. The bride fled screaming at the sight of Charles's swollen head, a scene that would become the whispered scandal of the century, though never printed openly. Historians later described him with terms that still make readers wince. Jaw like a cleft, tongue too large for speech, body frail, mind clouded. Yet the political machine demanded his survival. Ministers, courtiers, and doctors colluded in a delicate, grim dance of life support, medicinal opiates, and ritualistic prayer. And all the while, Mariana's own mental state frayed. She would scratch at portraits of her ancestors, muttering, "We bred monsters to sit on thrones," and retreat into prayer. convinced that divine punishment had struck her for a lineage she had no choice but to inherit. Charles survived into his late 30s, but the damage, genetic, physical, emotional, had already been done. The Habsburg jaw, the emblem of centuries of inbreeding, became more than a family curse. It became a metaphor for a dynasty choking on itself, clinging to power at the expense of health, sanity, and survival. Mariana watched as the empire fractured under her son's weakness, and eventually she was exiled to a convent, alone with her candles and prayers, the ghost of her family's mistakes lingering like incense in the stone corridors. And there we leave the palace for now, with its twisted corridors, shadowed chapels, and the silent, crawling prince who embodied the costs of obsession and obsession's heir. Because in the Habsburg court, perfection was less about beauty or strength and more about blood, and Mariana had learned far too late that sometimes perfection births monsters. Charles II's childhood, crawling through a dynasty. So, as we float back into the Habsburg palace, imagine the nursery, dimly lit, curtains drawn, the faint scent of incense and candle wax hanging in the air. There, on a rug thick enough to hide the creaks of the floorboards, crawled young Charles, the bewitched heir. And yes, crawling is exactly the word, because walking was a slow, painstaking process for him. He didn't toddle, he inched, hunched and fragile as if the floor itself might reject his weight. Court doctors whispered endlessly, jotting notes in elaborate handwriting, their quills scratching in rhythm with the boy's labored breaths. Eyes bulging, tongue oversized, limbs weak. Each of these observations became another line in a growing ledger of despair. Mariana, of course, hovered. Every sound Charles made, every twitch of his small body, was observed with the intensity of someone performing a ritual or waiting for a prophecy to unfold. She would light votive candles, muttering prayers that mingled with the faint scent of goat milk in the nursery air. The wet nurses played their quiet, essential role, mixing opiates into feeds to calm his frequent seizures. There is a certain tragic poetry in this. The very substances meant to soothe him would also lull him into a kind of quiet oblivion, keeping him alive while simultaneously keeping him from developing like other children. Every day was a careful balance between survival and stasis, between keeping him alive and not allowing his tiny, fragile body to collapse under the weight of the Habsburg expectations. Charles' playmates were non-existent. Nobility, of course, had children, but few would approach him. His deformities, combined with the unspoken fear surrounding the royal nursery, made him a curiosity rather than a friend. Sometimes Mariana's ladies-in-waiting would attempt gentle interactions, offering toys, softly singing, but Charles could barely respond. His speech, limited and often incomprehensible, frustrated everyone, including himself. In a palace built on appearances, even the youngest heir seemed to betray the family's idealized image of perfection. It was during these early years that the whispers about divine punishment gained momentum. Some priests insisted his deformities were a curse, a warning that God had rejected the dynasty's obsession with inbreeding. Others whispered about witches, hidden maledictions, or ancestral sins returned to haunt the present. Mariana naturally believed every word. She spent long hours in the royal chapel at night, kneeling before gilded icons, clutching rosary beads, murmuring pleas for her son's salvation. By candlelight, she imagined herself fighting off invisible demons that clung to Charles's tiny, contorted frame. And yet, despite all this, the boy survived. He survived because of meticulous attention, relentless care, and a court that, for all its pomp and ceremony, could not afford to see its line die out. The contrast was ironic. Everyone hated, pitied, or whispered about the boy, but no one could let him die. A dynasty was nothing if there was no living Habsburg to represent it, even if that living person barely resembled a human in the usual sense. By age 8, Charles could finally sit upright and take tentative steps, a development so celebrated that Mariana herself almost fainted from relief. Court physicians marked the milestone with elaborate charts and careful notation, probably because it was easier to record miracles than to watch the slow decay of hope. But walking did not equal health. His body remained frail, his mind slow, his speech stilted and halting. Every achievement seemed immediately overshadowed by his limitations. And then came the matter of education, because every king must be prepared to rule, right? Tutors arrived, men with powdered wigs and volumes of Latin texts, their expressions carefully neutral as they attempted to teach a boy whose jaw made pronouncing words almost impossible. Lessons were slow, tedious, and often humiliating. Charles could recognize letters and numbers, barely form sentences, and memorize prayers, but understanding and articulation were painfully limited. The irony was that he was destined to be the most powerful man in Spain, yet the very faculties that make governance possible were so crippled by his inbreeding that every decision rested not on reason, but on advisors, ministers, and court officials whispering behind closed doors. And then there were the emotional subtleties, if he could even be called emotional. Charles rarely expressed joy, rarely anger. He existed in a muted spectrum, drifting through corridors, sometimes staring at the walls, sometimes gazing at palace ceilings as if expecting them to fall. Mariana, meanwhile, oscillated between fierce protectiveness and despairing sorrow. She would scratch her ancestors' portraits, muttering curses at the generations that brought this frail boy into the world, blaming herself, her husband, and the past alike. The court, of course, had a vested interest in maintaining appearances. Noblemen and courtiers were instructed to treat Charles with deference, to avoid pointing out his deformities, to refrain from mentioning whispers. But even politeness could not erase reality. Servants hid mirrors, maids averted their eyes, and the young prince learned early that his body was both a spectacle and a source of fear. It is worth noting the peculiar dichotomy of this existence. Charles was both sacred and cursed. He represented continuity, legitimacy, and divine right. Yet every breath, every twitch, every stumble reminded the Habsburgs and the court of their own hubris. His very survival was a triumph of ritual, care, and obsessive control over nature. And yet, with every step he took, the family's tragic pattern became more obvious. By adolescence, Charles had become a man in body, but remained in so many ways a boy in capacity. His jaw still pronounced, his limbs still weak, his mind still limited. Every marriage proposal, every political alliance, every ceremony became a delicate negotiation between the necessity of appearances and the impossibility of normalcy. Mariana's obsession only deepened. She continued to pray, to light candles, to plead with God to reverse what nature had wrought. She had been trained all her life to uphold the dynasty, to ensure its continuity, and now she faced the ultimate paradox. She could not undo the blood she had inherited, and yet she was responsible for carrying it forward. In a sense, the palace itself seemed to bend around the boy. Floors creaked under him, walls absorbed his cries, ceilings watched silently as generations of physicians, priests, and nannies hovered. Life and death existed in delicate equilibrium, and Charles, crawling, limping, muttering, sleeping, was the fulcrum on which the fate of a nation balanced. And so we leave him there, still a child in body, a ruler in title, a symbol of centuries of obsession and miscalculation. The candles burn low in the chapel. The wet nurses whisper reassurances over warm milk. Mariana prays, scratches portraits, and dreams of reversing time. And the dynasty waits, fragile, anxious, and inevitably doomed to repeat the patterns that brought forth this most unusual, most tragic heir. The bewitched heir, adolescence, and the weight of a crown. As we drift forward in time, Charles II's childhood slowly gave way to adolescence, which in his case meant more crawling through the halls of a palace that whispered with every step, more whispered prayers, and more long hours of watching the world pass him by while he tried to exist within it. By the age of 12, he was still physically frail, jaw prominent, tongue oversized, and limbs weak. Walking remained tentative, unsteady, like a puppet learning to move for the first time. Every step was measured, every word painfully formed. The court, as always, hovered. Courtiers, tutors, and physicians all had opinions, and not a single one of them had the courage to admit that the young king was quite simply a living paradox. Heir to one of Europe's most powerful thrones, yet nearly incapable of functioning as a normal human being. Mariana, meanwhile, remained consumed by a mixture of awe, fear, and obsessive care. The royal chapel continued to be her nightly refuge, where candlelight flickered across stone walls as she begged God to lift the curse from her son's body. Education, of course, did not pause. Tutors attempted Latin, philosophy, history, and etiquette, but Charles struggled. His jaw made articulation tortuous. Speech was slow, deliberate, often incomprehensible. Letters and numbers could be memorized, but reasoning, debate, and decision-making were beyond his capacity. Yet every meeting of ministers and courtiers had to pretend he could contribute. Advisors whispered instructions into his ears, guiding his decisions, and the boy obediently repeated them, giving the illusion of sovereignty while his body and mind remained fragile vessels of dynastic ambition. Meanwhile, Mariana's obsession with bloodlines intensified. She meticulously documented every potential match for her son, scouring Europe for suitable brides to maintain the purity of the Habsburg line. The family's obsession with inbreeding, already centuries old, had created the very deformities and weaknesses she now desperately tried to mitigate. It is said that her selection criteria were exacting, bordering on obsessive: royal connections, physical health, and, most importantly, genetic proximity to the Habsburgs. Because why risk introducing impure blood when history had already been so forgiving to her family? Charles' physical condition continued to worsen in adolescence. His jaw hung in that famously pronounced fashion, giving him a perpetually open-mouthed expression. Speech remained labored, slurred, sometimes impossible. Weak limbs limited movement. Seizures still plagued him, and the royal wet nurses, who had been his silent saviors since infancy, continued to administer opiates discreetly to keep him alive and calm. To outsiders, it was a spectacle of meticulous care. To Mariana, it was a matter of survival for both her son and the dynasty he represented. Court life, in turn, became a strange theater of whispered fears, careful observation, and invisible boundaries. Servants tiptoed. Nobles avoided eye contact. Mirrors were hidden, not just to spare the boy's feelings, but because seeing his own reflection might trigger distress or humiliation. Charles existed in a bubble of careful attention, a fragile ecosystem designed to maintain life without truly supporting independence. And yet, despite his limitations, Charles began to participate in ceremonial duties. He attended Mass, processed through halls of gold and velvet, and received foreign envoys. His presence, frail and awkward as it was, served its purpose. The throne was occupied, the dynasty represented, and the continuity of Habsburg power maintained. Every observer understood the paradox. Here was a king whose physical and mental limitations were glaring, yet the mere fact of his survival carried political and symbolic weight far beyond his individual capacities. Adolescence also brought subtle tragedies of social isolation. Charles had few friends, no genuine companions of his age. Interaction was limited to polite courtiers or the occasional sibling, and even then, his deformities and fragility created an invisible barrier. Emotional expression, if it existed, was muted. Mariana, consumed by her duties and fears, could provide only cautious affection. Her prayers and rituals filled the gaps left by the absence of normal human contact. As Charles entered his teenage years, the first whispers of his eventual infertility began to circulate. His body, already fragile, displayed the first signs that reproduction would likely be impossible. The dynastic implications were devastating. Mariana, ever diligent, redoubled her efforts to secure politically advantageous alliances, knowing that her son might never produce heirs naturally. It is said that she obsessed over the political marriages that could preserve the Habsburg line, even while her own heart broke quietly for the child she had watched struggle his entire life. The palace itself seemed to conspire with these tragedies. Dark corridors, echoing halls, and silent chapels became the stage for a life lived under constant scrutiny. Every step, every word, every gesture was monitored, recorded, and judged. And Charles, fragile, awkward, and painfully aware of the expectations he could not fulfill, moved through this environment as both a prince and a perpetual cautionary tale. By the time he reached late adolescence, Charles's health had declined further. Physical weakness, poor coordination, and chronic illness combined with cognitive limitations to create a figure both pitiable and symbolically potent. He was the living embodiment of the consequences of centuries of inbreeding, yet the dynasty could not afford to let him fail entirely. Every medical intervention, every ritual, every moment of care was designed to sustain life, not to improve it. And Mariana, ever vigilant, continued her nightly vigils. The candles flickered in the chapel as she whispered desperate prayers over her son, pleading with God to lift the curse, mend his frail body, and preserve the Habsburg line. Her obsession, a mixture of maternal love and dynastic duty, defined every aspect of palace life. She had raised a son who was simultaneously king and victim, heir and prisoner, miracle and warning. So, as we leave Charles II crawling and stumbling through the palace corridors of adolescence, remember the paradox. A boy born into immense privilege, yet bound by the inescapable consequences of centuries of obsession with blood purity. Every moment of his life was shaped by dynastic ambition, medical intervention, religious ritual, and the quiet, relentless love and fear of his mother. And as the years passed, the stage was set for the next chapters. His eventual marriage, the continuation of the cursed bloodline, and the ultimate collapse of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty under the weight of inherited misfortune. The Bewitched King, adulthood, and the weight of a curse now. Let's drift forward once more and watch Charles II as he crosses the invisible threshold into adulthood. Imagine the palace halls echoing under the soft shuffle of his weak steps. At 20, Charles had become fully king in title, though his body and mind still resembled a child in many ways. He was called the Bewitched, a nickname whispered with a mix of pity, fear, and fascination. His jaw remained grotesquely pronounced, his tongue too large for speech, limbs still fragile, and his health perpetually precarious. Advisors guided every movement, every utterance. When foreign dignitaries visited, Charles presented an image of regal authority, but in truth, he relied entirely on ministers and courtiers to navigate politics. Every nod, every assent, every ceremonial gesture was orchestrated to maintain appearances. The irony was deliciously cruel. A king, ostensibly sovereign, utterly dependent on others to fulfill the duties of his crown. Mariana, still obsessed, continued to orchestrate his life with relentless vigilance. She scoured Europe for a bride, insisting that only a Habsburg or a closely allied royal would suffice, because after centuries of obsession with purity, nothing else would do. Every potential match was scrutinized for health, lineage, and political advantage. And yet, the inevitable horror awaited. Charles's body could not reproduce. His testicles had never descended. His fertility was non-existent. The bloodline, that sacred obsession, teetered on the edge of extinction. Finally, a bride was arranged. His niece, a young girl barely able to comprehend the enormity of the situation. The marriage ceremony was lavish, candles flickering in golden halls, courtiers pretending enthusiasm while hiding horror behind polite smiles. But when she saw him up close, the physical reality of his deformities struck too hard. His swollen head, grotesque jaw, and frail body made her scream, and she fled the bedchamber. Mariana, horrified yet undeterred, saw this as a temporary obstacle, one that could be overcome by duty and persistence. But the young bride's reaction foreshadowed the unspoken tragedy. This union, meant to preserve Habsburg purity, would fail in the most fundamental way. Despite these personal disasters, Charles maintained his role as king. Laws were passed, decrees issued, battles of diplomacy waged, all under the careful orchestration of ministers and advisors. Charles's presence was necessary, his decisions were symbolic. In reality, the machinery of governance ran almost entirely without him, a puppet master hidden behind ceremonial robes and an empty jaw. Medical attention remained constant. The palace was filled with physicians, apothecaries, and priests, all concerned with preserving the fragile vessel of Charles's body. Seizures continued. Fainting spells occurred without warning, and his skeletal frame betrayed the consequences of generations of inbreeding. Even as a man, he relied on goat milk laced with opiates for relief and survival. The palace was a theater of survival, and he was both star and audience, trapped in a life dictated by genetics and obsession. The irony of Charles's existence was not lost on the court. Here was a man considered king of Spain, yet his body betrayed every expectation of strength, vitality, and authority. His mind was slow, his speech nearly incomprehensible, his movements labored and awkward. And yet, every political event, every public appearance, reinforced the necessity of his survival. To die would have been to unravel the delicate tapestry of dynastic continuity, a risk Mariana and her advisors could never allow. And Mariana herself, the witch mother, as she would later be called, remained consumed by guilt, devotion, and obsessive care. She spent her nights in the royal chapel, lighting candles, praying, and whispering incantations meant to purify her son from the curse of his lineage. Portraits of ancestors, carefully painted and gilded, were often scratched or defaced in her frustration, as though attacking their images could undo centuries of genetic miscalculations. Her obsession was both maternal and political. To preserve Charles was to preserve the dynasty, and to fail was unthinkable. Court life, for others, was a performance. Courtiers tiptoed around the palace, careful not to startle him, careful not to mention his deformities aloud. Mirrors were hidden in the nursery, the hallways, and even private chambers. The boy's own reflection was considered a source of distress. And yet, despite all this, Charles persisted, limping through a life that was both a spectacle and a warning. As we float through this period of his life, it becomes clear that Charles's existence was a paradox, sacred yet cursed, royal yet pitiful, vital yet dependent. His body and mind bore the consequences of centuries of inbreeding, yet he survived because the dynasty could not afford to lose him. He became a living monument to both ambition and folly, a reminder that human obsession with perfection can sometimes produce nothing but tragedy. And so we leave Charles II in early adulthood, a king who rules in title but drifts through life with the fragility of a candle flame in a drafty palace. Mariana continues her prayers and rituals, courtiers continue their careful dance, and Spain waits, holding its breath, for a dynasty teetering on the edge of collapse. The political puppet and the dynasty's fragile future. Now, as Charles II settles into adulthood, we begin to see the full weight of the Habsburg obsession with blood purity, politics, and appearances. He was king in name and a curiosity in practice. Every action, every gesture, every breath had to be carefully orchestrated to preserve both the monarchy and the illusion of control. And the court. Oh, the court had learned long ago to tiptoe around him like he was a rare artifact that might shatter at any moment. Let's float into the royal chambers for a moment. Picture Charles, seated stiffly on a gilded throne, his jaw protruding as always, lips parted in permanent mild surprise, his tongue too large to articulate even simple words clearly. Advisors leaned in, whispering instructions. Courtiers bowed, nodded, and whispered some more. In essence, the machinery of the Spanish Empire ran on Charles's presence alone, while the decision-making, diplomacy, and administration were entirely in other hands. The king was a symbol, a vessel, a necessary prop in a dynastic play with very high stakes. Marriage became the next theater of tragedy. Mariana, still consumed by obsession, arranged for Charles to wed his own niece. Because if there's one thing the Habsburgs loved more than power, it was genetic continuity. The young bride, probably terrified of her new husband's grotesque appearance, fled the bridal chamber on the wedding night. And Mariana, well, she considered it a temporary setback. She clutched at every possible solution, from whispered prayers to ritual exorcisms, trying to rescue both the dynasty and her son from what she believed was divine punishment. Meanwhile, Charles's health continued to deteriorate. Weakness, seizures, difficulty speaking, and fragile limbs were constants in his life. The wet nurses who had sustained him as an infant remained his silent guardians. Opiates were administered discreetly, carefully balanced to keep him alive and calm, while the court whispered about his condition behind locked doors. Every doctor, priest, and servant was part of a delicate ecosystem, designed not to make Charles thrive, but simply to ensure he endured. This, of course, made political life extraordinarily complicated. Charles's decisions were often little more than echoes of the minister's instructions, relayed in a voice that could barely form complete sentences. Foreign envoys, diplomats, and ambassadors were expected to take his words as law, though in reality, they were receiving carefully scripted guidance. The illusion of a sovereign was maintained with meticulous attention, but the reality was painfully obvious to those who observed closely. Spain's most powerful figure was also its most vulnerable, and Mariana's obsession never waned. She continued to scour Europe for potential brides, maintaining meticulous charts of lineage and health, calculating every possible marriage as if she could engineer the continuation of the Habsburg line with nothing but careful mathematics and prayer. She spent nights in the chapel, lighting candles, whispering to God, scratching at family portraits when despair overcame her. "We bred monsters to sit on thrones," she muttered, and in her heart she feared she might be right. Court life adapted to Charles's peculiarities. Mirrors were hidden. Hallways were cleared of obstacles. The boy who had grown into a man remained physically fragile, socially isolated, and emotionally muted. Nobles tiptoed, servants whispered, and Mariana hovered like a vigilant specter. Yet, for all the attention and ritual, the inevitable truth persisted. The dynasty was teetering. Charles could not produce heirs naturally, and every carefully arranged alliance teetered on the edge of failure. Despite this, Charles persisted. He participated in ceremonies, attended mass, and maintained a public image of authority. His presence was essential to the state, even if his capacity for rulership was minimal. Each public appearance reminded everyone of the paradox: a king of immense symbolic power, yet physically and mentally fragile, a living testament to the consequences of centuries of inbreeding. And yet life inside the palace continued with an eerie, monotone rhythm. Candles flickered in dark halls. Priests whispered prayers. Wet nurses administered opiates. Advisors whispered instructions. Mariana prayed, scratched portraits, and burned votive candles into the night. And Charles? He moved through it all like a shadow, present but almost invisible, a symbol of continuity, a living warning, a fragile heir doomed by history's obsession with blood. In this period, it becomes clear that Charles II's life was less a story of a man than a study in inherited consequence. Every weakness, every deformity, every moment of fragility traced back through centuries of dynastic escion. And Mariana, for all her devotion, could not undo what generations had wrought. All she could do was preserve him, maintain appearances, and hope that the machinery of state could continue even as the heir himself struggled simply to survive. As the years passed, it became obvious to all observers that Spain was being carried on a delicate balance. Charles's presence was necessary. His decisions were performative. Every illness, every seizure, every fragile step became a reminder of the cost of obsession. And Mariana, trapped between maternal love and dynastic duty, bore the weight of a family's mistakes as heavily as any monarch ever could. So we leave Charles II at the height of early adulthood, a king whose body betrayed him, whose mind struggled to keep pace, and whose life was orchestrated entirely by those around him. He was sacred, cursed, pitied, and manipulated. And through it all, the dynasty hung on the fragile thread of his survival, as precarious as a candle flame in a drafty palace corridor. The Bewitched King's marriage and the illusion of continuity. Now we drift forward into one of the most infamous chapters of Charles II's life. His marriage, a political maneuver meant to preserve the Habsburg bloodline at all costs. Imagine the palace again, gilded halls stretching into shadows, the weight of centuries pressing down with every echo of footsteps. Mariana, ever vigilant, had arranged for her son to marry his niece, a union dictated by obsession with genetic purity rather than love, compatibility, or even basic human decency. The bride, barely old enough to understand her predicament, arrived at the palace, flanked by cautious courtiers and whispering advisors. Charles, now a man in body but still fragile, weak and awkward, awaited in his ceremonial chamber. His jaw remained grotesquely pronounced, lips parted in the familiar mild surprise. Limbs frail, posture hunched, He was a living testament to generations of inbreeding, a man whose very existence was both sacred and cursed. The wedding itself was a spectacle of golden pomp, heavy with candlelight and ritual. But the night quickly descended into farce. The bride, upon seeing Charles close, recoiled in horror. His swollen head, awkward movements, and grotesque jaw rendered intimacy impossible. She fled the bedchamber screaming, leaving Mariana aghast but undeterred. For Mariana, this was not an emotional failure, but a logistical obstacle, one she believed could be overcome by ritual, prayer, and careful management of appearances. Meanwhile, Charles's health remained precarious. Seizures, weakness, and frailty continued to dominate his life. His speech was slow, labored, often incomprehensible, yet every public appearance demanded that he seem sovereign, capable, kingly. Advisors whispered guidance in his ear. Courtiers orchestrated his movements. The machinery of state functioned around him as if he were merely a ceremonial figurehead. In this strange theater of power, Charles existed as a symbol rather than an autonomous agent, the ultimate paradox of monarchy. Mariana's obsession with dynastic purity persisted. She meticulously documented every potential political match, scoured Europe for suitable candidates, and relied on priests, physicians, and astrologers alike to safeguard the fragile line of succession. Her nightly vigils in the royal chapel became ever more frantic. Candles flickered against stone walls as she whispered desperate prayers over her son's bed, scratching at portraits of ancestors and muttering the bitter truth she dared not voice aloud. We bred monsters to sit on thrones. The court, as always, adapted. Mirrors remained hidden. Hallways were cleared of obstacles. Courtiers tiptoed around the fragile king, knowing that any misstep could cause distress or humiliation. Charles himself existed in a liminal space, physically adult, mentally stunted, and emotionally muted. He was present at events, but largely invisible in substance, a living symbol of the consequences of unchecked dynastic obsession. As the months passed, it became painfully clear that the marriage would not produce heirs. Charles was infertile. His body could not sustain the very purpose for which it had been designed by centuries of inbreeding. The dynasty, which Mariana had nurtured with prayers, rituals, and obsessive vigilance, teetered on the brink. Advisors whispered, courtiers speculated, and the king continued to drift through life, a fragile vessel upon which the fate of Spain rested. And yet, despite all this, Charles survived. The palace operated like a living organism, each person performing their role to keep him alive. Wet nurses administered opiates for comfort and stability. Physicians monitored every physical weakness. Priests performed prayers and minor exorcisms. The machinery of life and state intertwined so tightly that Charles' survival, no matter how limited, was essential. It is here that the tragedy of Charles II becomes most palpable. He was both king and prisoner, sacred and cursed, essential and helpless. Mariana, caught between devotion and duty, bore the weight of the dynasty's history on her shoulders, praying for a miracle that would never come. Spain, meanwhile, watched, waited, and whispered, holding its breath as the fragile king drifted through ceremonies, diplomatic meetings, and courtly life, all while his body betrayed the very authority he was meant to embody. Charles's existence remained a paradox in motion, a symbol of divine right, a living cautionary tale of inbreeding, and a fragile human being navigating a world that demanded both reverence and perfection. And so, the palace continued its quiet, deliberate rhythm, candles flickering, whispers passing through gilded corridors, wet nurses attending, Mariana praying, and Charles, the bewitched king, enduring life in its most controlled and constrained form. Here we leave him, a man whose life is dictated by others, whose body and mind are fragile, yet whose presence alone preserves the illusion of continuity for a dynasty hanging by a thread. The stage is set for the final chapters of his life, a lifetime of struggle, political manipulation, and the slow, inevitable decline of a line obsessed with purity and perfection. The Bewitched King and the Shadow of Spain's Decline. As we float further into Charles II's life, it becomes clear that his personal struggles were inseparable from the fate of Spain itself. The palace, for all its grandeur, functioned as a fragile stage for appearances. Every ceremony, every diplomatic meeting, every mass was meticulously orchestrated to make the world believe that the king was competent, even while he remained weak, frail, and profoundly dependent. By this time, Charles had fully entered adulthood. His jaw, still grotesquely pronounced, gave him a permanent expression of astonishment or bewilderment, and his tongue often made speech nearly impossible. Limbs remained weak, frail from years of inbreeding. Physical activity beyond walking from one chamber to another was largely impossible. Courtiers whispered about his unusual features, but no one dared speak openly. Mirrors remained hidden in the palace, as if seeing one's reflection might awaken some hidden horror, or remind Charles of his own deformities. Political life, meanwhile, became a delicate dance. Charles's advisors effectively ran the country while he served as a living emblem of legitimacy. Ministers wrote decrees, navigated foreign diplomacy, and managed the economy, while Charles, seated stiffly on his throne, occasionally nodded or repeated words whispered into his ear. The illusion of royal authority was maintained, but substance was entirely absent. And Mariana, ever the obsessive mother, hovered over every detail, dictating alliances, reviewing marriage proposals, and praying nightly for divine intervention. The dynastic obsession with purity continued to dictate every decision. Charles' infertility was an inconvenient truth, but one that could not be spoken openly. The Habsburg obsession with keeping the bloodline for pure left the family with no alternative but to manipulate, arrange, and control every marital possibility. Mariana tirelessly pursued this, analyzing potential brides and recording genealogical charts with a meticulousness bordering on mania. Her devotion was both maternal and political. Failure to preserve the bloodline was unthinkable. Despite the fragile state of the king, Spain's external position demanded appearances. Envoys from other European courts arrived to negotiate treaties, alliances, and marriages. Charles appeared regal, seated on his throne with a crown heavy on his head. Yet every action required careful orchestration. Ministers whispered instructions. Courtiers ensured he moved with the correct posture, and physicians remained ever vigilant to prevent collapse. He was simultaneously sovereign and puppet, a paradox that only added to the aura of tragedy surrounding his life. The palace itself seemed to mourn his condition. Candlelight flickered over marble floors, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally long. The walls, adorned with portraits of ancestors who had perpetuated the cycle of inbreeding, seemed to watch silently. Mariana, the witch mother, in whispered rumor, spent nights scratching at these portraits, muttering curses, prayers, and regrets. She blamed herself, her husband, her parents, and every generation before her for producing a child so fragile, so cursed, and yet so central to the survival of the dynasty. Charles's daily life was governed by routine and intervention. Wet nurses administered opiates to keep him calm and stable. Physicians monitored his every movement, seizures, and weakness. Priests performed prayers and minor exorcisms, seeking to ward off any lingering curse. The boy who had crawled through the nursery now moved cautiously through the palace halls as a king who could barely govern a man who could barely exist independently, and a living embodiment of the consequences of centuries of obsession with blood purity. Socially, Charles remained isolated. Few courtiers dared approach him closely, and friendships were virtually non-existent. Emotional expression was limited to fleeting glimpses of frustration or confusion. Mariana, ever present, provided the only sustained connection in his life, a mixture of fear, devotion, and obsessive care. Her maternal love was inseparable from her political ambition, creating a complex dynamic in which every gesture, every precaution, every prayer was both personal and dynastic. And so Spain drifted under the shadow of the Bewitched King. The kingdom's fate was tied not to Charles' abilities, but to the careful orchestration of court, ministers, and mother. The illusion of stability persisted, yet the cracks were obvious to those who looked closely. Generations of obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines had produced a fragile ruler whose existence required constant intervention. The crown, the throne, and the empire itself were balanced precariously atop the shoulders of a man who could barely support himself. By now, Charles's health had begun to decline noticeably. Seizures became more frequent. Weakness increased. Speech remained labored and slow. Yet, despite the inevitability of deterioration, he survived, supported by a network of devotion, manipulation, and relentless care. Every day he lived was a testament to the persistence of ritual, duty, and dynastic obsession, a reminder that human ambition can extend life in the most meticulous and controlled ways. And Mariana, ever vigilant, continued her nightly vigil in the royal chapel. Candles flickered, prayers whispered, portraits scratched, and dynastic charts meticulously reviewed. Her son's survival was both a miracle and a burden, and the palace itself seemed to breathe with the tension of a life sustained against both nature and history. Charles II, the Bewitched King, remained the fragile epicenter of Spain's fading power, a man who embodied both the tragedy of human ambition and the strange resilience of life when preserved with obsessive care. The Bewitched King's later years, decline and the weight of history. As we drift into Charles II's later years, the palace seems even quieter, heavier, as if it too feels the strain of centuries of inbreeding and dynastic obsession. Charles's body continued its slow, relentless decline. Limbs weaker than ever, jaw grotesquely pronounced, tongue oversized, seizures frequent. He remained alive, barely, a fragile symbol propped up by the efforts of dozens of devoted caretakers. By now, the illusion of sovereignty was nearly complete. Charles appeared at court, nodded during ceremonies, repeated phrases whispered into his ear, and somehow maintained the semblance of a functioning monarch. In truth, Spain was governed entirely by ministers and advisors who carefully orchestrated every decision. Charles' presence was crucial, not for policy, but as the living emblem of legitimacy. The paradox remained painfully clear. The kingdom's fate rested on a man who could barely stand, speak, or act independently. Marriage, as we know, had failed to secure heirs. Charles's wife, his niece, had fled in terror on their wedding night, leaving the dynastic line without a future. Mariana's obsession with purity, her meticulous planning, and her countless prayers had yielded nothing in terms of continuation. Yet she persisted. She continued to scour Europe for potential brides, hoping against hope that the Habsburg bloodline might yet survive. Even as history had already dealt its harsh verdict, the palace became a theater of fragile life. Wet nurses still administered opiates to quell seizures. Physicians monitored his pulse, his breathing, and every tremor. Priests whispered prayers over the king, performed minor exorcisms, and chronicled every aspect of his condition. The hallways, corridors, and chambers echoed with the sounds of careful movements, whispered instructions, and the quiet rhythm of lives dedicated entirely to preserving a man who could barely sustain his own existence. And Mariana, now older, more fragile herself, continued her nightly vigils. Candles burned low in the royal chapel as she whispered desperate prayers for her son's survival. She scratched at portraits of ancestors who had perpetuated the cycle of inbreeding, muttering curses at generations of Habsburgs who had prioritized blood purity over health and humanity. Her obsession, equal parts maternal devotion and dynastic duty, defined every corner of palace life. Social interaction for Charles remained minimal. Courtiers maintained the illusion of normalcy, yet most approached with caution, speaking in whispers and avoiding direct observation. Mirrors were hidden, hallways cleared, and every precaution taken to prevent distress or humiliation. The king drifted through life like a shadow, simultaneously present and absent, a living symbol of both dynastic ambition and inherited misfortune. Politically, Spain became increasingly dependent on ministers and advisors. Charles's decisions were often nothing more than the echo of their instructions. Foreign policy, domestic governance, and diplomacy functioned without him, while he remained a ceremonial anchor, a reminder of continuity and a living monument to centuries of inbreeding. The paradox was evident to all. Spain relied entirely on a fragile figure who could barely engage with the world, yet without him the very legitimacy of the monarchy might collapse. Health continued to decline. Seizures became more frequent and intense. Weakness increased. Speech remained limited, nearly impossible in moments of stress. Still he survived, propped up by the devotion and vigilance of those around him. Each day of survival was a testament to ritual, care, and obsession. a fragile equilibrium maintained against both nature and history. As Charles aged, Mariana's despair deepened. Her prayers, her rituals, her obsessive charting of family bloodlines could not undo the damage of generations. She had raised a son who was both king and victim, sacred and cursed, dependent and central to the survival of a kingdom. And in those quiet, candlelit nights of prayer, she whispered the truth she had long known. We bred monsters to sit on thrones, and her son, frail and awkward, was the living embodiment of that sentence. The palace itself seemed to reflect the inevitability of decline. Echoes of past grandeur mixed with the fragile present. Chandeliers swung slightly in empty corridors. Candles flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across portraits of ancestors who had prioritized bloodlines over life. And through it all moved Charles II, the bewitched king, fragile, awkward, dependent, yet paradoxically essential. A living symbol of both human ambition and the unrelenting weight of history. In this period of decline, the tragedy of the Habsburg obsession is undeniable. Centuries of prioritizing blood purity over health, strength, and vitality culminated in a king who could barely stand, speak, or act independently, yet whose mere presence preserved the kingdom's legitimacy. Mariana, ministers, courtiers, priests, and wet nurses all maintained the delicate machinery of life, allowing Spain to function while its king existed in a state of fragile, ongoing endurance. And so, we leave Charles II drifting further into his later years. A man trapped between life and legacy, a living monument to dynastic obsession, and a fragile epicenter upon which the fate of a kingdom balanced precariously. Mariana continued her prayers, the palace maintained its careful rhythm, and Charles persisted. A slow, deliberate reminder of the costs of obsession, the fragility of human ambition, and the paradoxical resilience of life sustained against all odds. The Bewitched King's final years, collapse of a dynasty. As Charles II entered the final stretch of his life, the weight of centuries of dynastic obsession pressed down more heavily than ever. The palace, with its gilded halls and flickering candlelight, had become a place where time moved slowly, almost as if the building itself were mourning the inevitable end. Charles, still frail, awkward, and dependent, continued to serve as the living emblem of the Habsburg dynasty, even as the empire he symbolized began to crumble around him. By now, every aspect of his existence was carefully managed. Courtiers whispered, advisors guided, wet nurses administered opiates, and priests performed prayers and rituals, all to preserve life and maintain the appearance of sovereignty. Mirrors remained hidden to prevent distress. Hallways were cleared to avoid accidents, and every day of survival became a small, meticulously orchestrated miracle. Charles's jaw remained grotesquely pronounced, his tongue oversized, his limbs frail. Every physical imperfection was amplified by the court's obsession with appearances, and yet, despite all odds, he endured. The failure to produce an heir had become a political crisis. Mariana's obsessive efforts to find suitable Habsburg brides had yielded nothing. Charles' infertility was undeniable, and with every passing year, the dynasty's future grew more precarious. Ministers and advisors whispered about potential succession plans, foreign alliances, and the looming collapse of Spain's monarchy. Yet Charles remained at the center of it all, a fragile symbol upon which the empire precariously balanced. Charles's own health had begun to deteriorate noticeably. Seizures grew more frequent, weakness intensified, and his speech remained slow, labored, and largely incomprehensible. Every step, every gesture, every word required careful orchestration. The king existed less as a person and more as a living, breathing monument to the consequences of centuries of inbreeding and dynastic obsession. Mariana, still obsessed, continued nightly vigils in the royal chapel, praying and lighting candles, scratching at portraits of ancestors, and muttering bitterly about the bloodlines that had created such fragility. As time passed, Charles's role as king became almost entirely ceremonial. Political decisions were guided entirely by ministers, foreign ambassadors, and court advisors. The illusion of authority was maintained with careful choreography. Charles nodded, repeated whispered phrases, and attended ceremonies. But the reality was stark. Spain was effectively governed without him, while he persisted as the fragile, awkward, and dependent face of continuity. Every observer understood the paradox: a sovereign who could barely survive, yet whose survival was essential to maintain the legitimacy of the monarchy. Mariana's obsession with preserving the dynasty never waned, even as the inevitable became apparent. She meticulously reviewed genealogical charts, scoured Europe for potential solutions, and clung to religious rituals, all in an effort to stave off what had already become history's judgment. She had raised a son who was simultaneously king and victim, sacred and cursed, dependent yet essential. The palace itself seemed to echo her despair, the flickering candlelight and empty corridors reflecting the fragility of life within those walls. In the final years, Charles's decline became more evident to all who witnessed it. Weakness prevented him from walking unaided, speech was minimal, and his body reflected the cumulative damage of generations of inbreeding. The court, priests, and wet nurses continued their vigilant care, ensuring survival through rituals, medicine, and devotion. Every day he lived was a fragile miracle, a testament to the relentless efforts of those around him and the paradoxical resilience of life under extreme duress. And yet, despite all precautions, the end approached. Charles' life, a slow, deliberate chronicle of fragility and care, had become the stage upon which the final act of a centuries-long dynastic obsession was played. Mariana, ministers, and courtiers alike understood that the survival of a line could not continue beyond him. The dynasty that had obsessed over blood purity for generations was now collapsing, a process both tragic and inevitable. As Charles drifted through these last years, he became more ghost than man, a figure at once present and absent, essential and pitiful, sacred and cursed. His existence embodied the consequences of human ambition, obsession with genetic purity, and the relentless machinery of dynastic survival. Spain itself, tied so tightly to his fragile life, trembled as ministers prepared for a future without the bewitched king at its center. And so, we leave Charles II in the twilight of his life, a man whose body betrayed him, whose mind struggled, yet whose survival had been propped up for decades by devotion, manipulation, and obsessive care. Mariana continued her nightly rituals, the palace maintained its delicate choreography, and Charles endured, a fragile epicenter upon which the weight of history balanced precariously. The final chapters, the ultimate collapse of the Habsburg dynasty, and the haunting legacy of the Bewitched King were fast approaching. Last part, the Bewitched King's death and the fall of a dynasty. And now we arrive at the final act of Charles II's life, a slow, deliberate conclusion to centuries of dynastic obsession, inbreeding, and human folly. The palace, already heavy with history, grew quieter, as if even the walls were holding their breath for the inevitable. Charles, frail and fragile beyond measure, had become almost entirely dependent on those around him. Wet nurses, physicians, priests, and courtiers orchestrated every moment of his existence, ensuring that he survived, if only barely, long enough to maintain the illusion of continuity. By his late 30s, Charles's health had deteriorated to a near unimaginable degree. Seizures were frequent and exhausting. His jaw protruded grotesquely, making even eating a monumental task. Limbs remained weak, frail, and awkward. Speech was slow, slurred, and often incomprehensible. His body had become a living testament to the consequences of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. Each deformity a historical record of obsession with genetic purity over vitality. And yet, despite all this, he persisted, propped up by opiates, prayers, and meticulous care. Mariana, the obsessive mother whose life had been intertwined with her son's every breath, remained ever vigilant. She spent countless nights in the royal chapel, lighting candles, praying, and whispering over the fragile figure she had nurtured so carefully. Portraits of ancestors were scratched, genealogical charts meticulously reviewed, and the weight of generations of mistakes pressed down on her with each flickering flame. She whispered bitterly to herself, "We bred monsters to sit on thrones." And in Charles, the living culmination of centuries of obsession, her words had found their tragic embodiment. As the inevitable approached, ministers and advisors grew increasingly anxious. The king's presence remained essential, even as his body failed him. Spain, tied so tightly to his survival, would soon face a crisis. Every foreign diplomat, every courtier, every priest understood that Charles' death would mark not only the end of his life, but the collapse of a centuries-old dynastic dream. And still, he lingered, a fragile, awkward, yet stubborn symbol of continuity, a living reminder of human ambition's extreme consequences. On the day of his passing, the palace moved with careful, hushed precision. Candles flickered in the still air, wet nurses monitored his breathing one final time, and priests whispered prayers over the king's fragile body. Charles II, the bewitched, the frail and awkward, the cursed yet essential, drew his last breath at the age of 38. His body, so long a testament to dynastic obsession, now finally gave way. Autopsy revealed the grim details whispered in court rumors: a heart no larger than a peppercorn, a brain melted like cheese, and a body ravaged by centuries of genetic miscalculation. The medical record, clinical and cold, mirrored the tragic narrative of his life. With Charles's death, the Habsburg dynasty teetered on the edge of collapse. The obsession with blood purity, the carefully arranged marriages, the prayers, rituals, and obsessive care, all had led to this moment. Spain, long held together by the fragile continuity of Charles's life, now faced political fragmentation and uncertainty. Mariana, the witch mother, was blamed, exiled to a convent where she spent her remaining days scratching family portraits, muttering regrets, and witnessing the consequences of generations of obsession. Her son, fragile and cursed, had survived for decades, only to leave behind a kingdom and a dynasty in crisis. And so the story ends, not with triumph, glory, or conquest, but with the slow, inevitable collapse of human ambition when bound by obsession, inbreeding, and the relentless pursuit of purity. Charles II, the Bewitched King, lived a life orchestrated by others, trapped in a fragile body and burdened by centuries of dynastic expectation. He was a man whose survival was miraculous, whose existence was tragic, and whose death marked the definitive end of a line obsessed with perfection. The palace grew silent. Candles burned low, shadows stretched across gilded corridors, and the legacy of the Habsburg obsession lingered in every stone and painting. Mariana's prayers ceased. Ministers and courtiers began the slow, delicate work of rebuilding a kingdom without its fragile king. And Charles II, who had existed as both man and symbol, passed from life into history, a haunting, tragic figure whose life reminds us gently but persistently that ambition unchecked by reason can breed monsters to sit on thrones. In 17th century Madrid, the Habsburg obsession with blood purity reached its tragic apex in Mariana of Austria and her son Charles II, the Bewitched King. Born from generations of inbreeding, Charles' jaw protruded grotesquely. His limbs remained weak, and his mind struggled to keep pace with the expectations of a throne he could barely occupy. From a frail, crawling child to a painfully awkward adult, his life was orchestrated entirely by a network of wet nurses, physicians, priests, and his obsessive mother. Every marriage, every diplomatic meeting, every public appearance was carefully staged to maintain the illusion of authority, even as Spain teetered on the edge of dynastic collapse. The kingdom survived only as long as Charles did, a living monument to human ambition, obsession, and the devastating consequences of prioritizing pure blood over health and life. His death at 38 marked the definitive end of a dynasty, leaving a kingdom fractured, a mother broken, and a chilling lesson in the high cost of obsession. Step into the shadows of one of history's most cursed dynasties and witness the tragic life of a king who survived against all odds. But at what cost? Watch now and see why the Habsburg obsession with purity created monsters to sit on thrones.